So good morning, welcome to week 3 of our lectures for Advanced Business Economics. Today what we'll be covering is lecture 5, and that's Externalities and the Environment. The prescribed reading is Stiglitz and Rosengart, chapter 6, specifically for this content. So what this lecture will cover is the problem of externalities. So why is it a problem that a given entity's activities result in a cost being borne by a party that is not involved in the activity? Then we will talk about private solutions to externalities and also public sector solutions to externalities. So what is an externality? Let's begin with that. Well, an externality arises when either an individual or a firm undertakes an action that has an effect on another individual or firm for which the latter does not pay or is not paid. So for example, when I'm driving my car, I'm producing pollution. So what happens? Somebody else bears that cost that is not involved in the activity that I'm undertaking, and that is namely driving. Yet there is a cost that is imposed upon those parties. In other words, excess pollution from my activity. So essentially it's my activities imposing a cost on those who are not involved in that activity. That is when an externality arises. However, externalities can be both positive and negative. So positive externalities arise when the actions of an individual or a firm confer benefits to others. So for example, if I go planting trees, I might be planting trees for my benefit, but because I'm beautifying my surroundings, everyone else is also benefiting without me directly trying to bestow a benefit upon them. So that would be an example of a positive externality. A negative externality, well, I've already mentioned that. That is the example of me driving my car and somebody having to bear the cost of the pollution that is associated with my activities, yet not being involved in my activities. Now, the reason why we worry about externalities is because the result is an inefficient resource allocation. And that is essentially why we need to talk about externalities. So how externalities are a problem? Well, again, we can use our supply and demand framework and demonstrate as to why we should worry about externalities and what the consequence is of so-called negative externalities. So think about it this way. Let's say you have a number of producers that produce steel in an industry. And if you sum the quantities produced corresponding to specific prices, what you essentially have is you have the supply curve. All right, so this is what we have. And that represents the marginal private costs, or the summation of the marginal private costs of individual suppliers in the market. So all of them are producing steel, let's say. All these producers produce a given quantity of steel corresponding to specific price levels. And this is what gives us our supply. So hence we can also view this as a marginal private cost that is associated with producing additional units of steel. And the reason why we call it the private cost and marginal private cost, because this relates to individual steel producers and a summation thereof. However, the problem that we also have is that all of these producers of steel are also producing pollution. So what does that imply? Well, because they are producing pollution, what this implies is that the true cost is higher of producing that steel. It's not only the labor and the ore that goes in the production of steel. What also goes into the production of steel is the cost associated with pollution. So that means is that the costs are not reflected in the supply curve that we are looking at, this supply curve specifically, which corresponds to marginal private costs. The costs are associated with the direct costs that are borne, excluding the externalities, by steel producers. Now, if this is the case, if we don't take into consideration pollution, and that externalities are being produced, or the presence of externalities in the form of pollution, the quantity that will be produced at that point is Q subscript M. It corresponds to this point here. So that is how much steel we would be producing. But the reality is when we account for the costs associated with pollution, so essentially this is a cost that is added on top of ore and labor costs. In other words, on top of the marginal private cost, those costs that are borne directly by the producers, what we arrive at is a marginal social cost curve. So the marginal social cost curve takes into the consideration the total extra costs, which are both private, in other words, private, that are borne by steel producers themselves, and also social, that are associated with the pollution that is created by producing additional units of steel. And then what we have is a somewhat different situation. In other words, now what we have is the marginal social cost curve equaling the marginal benefit curve. And hence that corresponds to a lower quantity of steel being produced, which is represented on our diagram as Q subscript E. So therefore, the efficient level of production is lower than the market equilibrium level. So this is the market equilibrium level. This is what we would be producing if we don't take into consideration the presence of externalities, which do contribute over and above a private cost that is borne by producers. So in other words, the efficient quantity would be lower. This is where we would be, as opposed to this point here. So we should be producing less steel than we are currently producing after accounting for costs associated with externalities. So why is it externalities arise? Well, essentially it's a common resource problem. You have a resource that is limited, but on the other hand, access is not restricted. So multiple participants can make use of that resource. However, the idea is that the use of that resource by additional participants has an impact on all other participants. So let's take an example of a lake in which the total number of fishes increases as the number of fishing boats enters the lake. So as you have each additional boat entering a lake to fish, well, the result is that although the total amount increases, the catch per boat decreases. Okay, so if you take the total divided by the amount of boats, well, what happens? The average number of fish caught per boat decreases. Now, why is that? Well, because the number of fish is limited, so hence each additional boat decreases the catch that is made by all other boats. So essentially you are seeing an externality. And that externality is in the form of a decrease experienced by all other boats as a result of an additional boat entering the lake to fish in that lake. So how many boats should enter the lake? Well, as long as the cost of a boat is greater than the marginal social return, it makes sense for boats to enter the lake. So the efficient number of boats is at this point. On the other hand, here we have a market equilibrium. So again, the market equilibrium is above the efficient number of boats. So hence, we have too many boats that are fishing. So again, this presents itself in a problem. We have an externality, and that leads to too many boats fishing. Okay. In other words, what is happening is that the marginal social return is now below the cost of a boat. But instead, the quantity caught should be corresponding to this point. So how can we effectively resolve externalities, or how can we promote positive externalities and discourage negative externalities? Well, some private solutions are as follows. Number one, to internalize an externality. Number two, to assign property rights, and then also to use the legal system. And we'll discuss these in turn on the slides that follow. So first of all, internalizing externalities essentially applies forming an economic unit of a sufficient size so that most of the consequences of any action occur within that unit. Okay, in other words, stating it like this. So let's say we have a block of apartments. So there's a small community living in a block of apartments or a couple of apartments, apartment blocks. Consider a residential complex. And what can happen within that residential complex? Well, one of the residents can decide to begin beautifying and planting flowers. So what essentially happens is, well, that benefits an entire community then. Why? Because they see that, well, this person has a nice balcony or a nice little or has created a nice little flower bed before the apartment block that they are staying in. So that's great. There's no problem with that. That essentially is an example of a positive externality. But where it becomes a little bit different is, let's say that somebody in those apartments is playing very loud music all day long past 10 o'clock. Obviously, everyone else is bearing the cost of that. They can't sleep, for example. They are disturbed. They can't concentrate. They can't work from home. Simply, they don't enjoy the music that's being played. For whatever reason, they do not like the fact that there is one resident that plays music at all the time. And hence they don't like this disturbance. This is an example of a negative externality. But because they are functioning in an economic unit, in an association, what happens is that the residents that are negatively impacted by this can take some kind of action to put a stop to this person's behavior, the person that is being so disruptive and playing music all the time and disturbing others. So they can put a stop to this negative externality being generated, the source of this negative externality. So hence, essentially, because we have an economic unit, there is a collective decision to do something about the source of that negative externality. Okay, and this action is possible because there is an association of residents. In other words, an economic unit of sufficient size. Okay, because we have that. Next, we have something called the Coase theorem. And the idea here is, or the basis of this is, that when there are no consequences for using a specific resource, externalities will arise. So for example, if there are no limits on how many fishermen can fish from the lake in our previous example, then what happens is that everyone's affected because the average return falls per boat, and so does the marginal return to boat fall. Because as additional boats enter, fewer fish are caught by every individual boat. So how can we solve this? Well, the idea is that what we can do is we can assign property rights. So property rights assign to a particular individual the right to control some assets and to receive fees for a given property's use, or alternatively for the use of a specific resource. So in simple terms, what we could do is we could essentially privatize the lake in our example and then charge fees for its use. So whoever will own that lake has an incentive to make sure that there is a limitation of how many fish can be caught at a given time. In simplest terms, what can potentially happen is that if too many boats are permitted, all the fish will be caught. And if there's no fish, well, what happens? Then fees can no longer be charged because no one will come to fish because there's nothing to catch. So that individual then owns, or the company that owns that lake, has an incentive to ensure a more efficient allocation of fish. So that is the example there. Another example is an oil pool. So let's say you want to drill oil, and let's say that all you need to do is you need to buy land. So what will happen is that if there's a single oil pool and if there's additional drilling that is associated with the purchases of additional land, because there is a single pool of oil, the result is that each additional well results in less oil, similarly to our example of the fishermen in a lake where there is a limited amount of fish. So each additional well results in less because the total pool of oil is limited. So again, this is when we can assign property rights, and what we can do is we can make sure that one person owns the land under which that oil pool exists. And hence, what we would like to see in this instance, or what we are likely to see, is that that individual that now owns that land upon which we find the oil ensures that the correct number of wells is drilled. So what happens is that we enhance economic efficiency by having someone own a specific resource and having that person regulate it in order to ensure a more efficient outcome. So essentially, the Coase theorem speaks to this concept of property rights of a common resource. A common resource should be owned. Even when this is not the case, when there is no single individual or entity that owns a resource, the market may nevertheless still find a mechanism of dealing with an externality. The externality with our example fishing and oil drilling was that each additional well or each additional boat would result in less oil being drilled, and also, well, individually on an individual basis, on an average basis, and also fewer fish per boat on an individual basis and also on an average basis. So hence externality, the externality that was imposed is that, or the externality that was imposed was that each additional participant in a specific activity was able to access less of that resource, of the resource in question. So even when we don't have a single entity, what may happen is that a specific association of, let's say, those that drill oil, as an example, will get together to unitize their production in order to coordinate production, to make sure that too many wells are not drilled. In other words, they are willing to accept that, yes, if there are multiple participants, what will happen is that we are drilling less oil each and on average, but at the same time, we make sure that we don't allow additional participants from the outside so that our individual production falls. Again, this requires an association. So this is where the Coase theorem arises. What it proposes is that when there are externalities, parties can get involved together to make some sort of arrangement of which the externality is internalized and efficiency is ensured. So for example, an additional example as is proposed in the textbook or as is set out in the textbook, let's say you have smokers and non-smokers. And if non-smokers are now bearing a high cost for the actions of the smokers, in other words, smoke that they are now forced to inhale, which is an externality, what they can do is they can get together in order to internalize the externality and get the smokers or compensate the smokers not to smoke. So essentially what we are looking at is either giving ownership to someone that will regulate a resource, or forming an association that will protect a resource. And in this instance, what will happen is by having such an association or someone holding ownership, an externality, negative externality, will be eliminated or reduced, and hence efficiency will be enhanced. What we can also do is we can use the legal system in order to deal with externalities. And this is specifically applicable both when property rights are defined and when property rights are not defined. But the situation we're going to cover here is when property rights are not exactly defined. So in 2010, there was an explosion and fire on the BP license Trans-Ocean drilling rig Deepwater Horizon. So this was quite a bit of a scandal, and this is considered to be the worst oil spill in history, and this generated an externality in the form of fishermen being affected, their catch being affected, and also environmental damage. And a lot of people value the environment, so they viewed themselves as now having to bear the cost of this. However, because it happened in a place where on the oceans where there are not clearly defined property rights, and also impacted fishermen and those that value the environment, which is essentially what is the environment and what specific aspects of the environment do they value. That is the question that arises. So there is a lot of lack of clarity as to what is impacted, and how it should be, or how should these externalities be addressed, given that there is no firm ownership of these resources in terms of the fish and wildlife that is affected, and also in terms of the environment. So what was the response in this instance? Well, what the US government did is it essentially sued BP over violations of safety regulations and sought unlimited damages to cover the cost of the oil cleanup and long-term environmental damage and local business losses. So all these things that could not be directly quantified, or all these costs that could not be quantified, were given some guidance, or were given some kind of quantification by reference to the legal system, or specifically deference to the legal system, which gave some guidance as to what the losses are and as what can be compensated, as to what can be compensated. So in short, the legal system can be used to define compensation and action on or related to aspects that are not clear, such as the environment or such as wildlife. Who owns this, and how far out of the borders of a country these resources are owned by the public, and what is their value. And this obviously can apply to in multiple situations where there is no clear definition as to what losses are, what resources are, who owns these resources, and as to how externalities, negative externalities, should be approached. So thus far what we have discussed is the private remedies for externalities, such as the ownership of a common resource by an entity that regulates it and has an incentive to ensure the efficient allocation of its use. However, sometimes there is a requirement for government to intervene. So first of all, this would be the case for some public goods. So in many instances, it is very difficult to exclude anyone from enjoying the benefit of a public good. So, for example, it would be very difficult for anyone to exclude us from enjoying clean air. Everyone can breathe, and there's no real regulation on it. In terms of who can breathe, well, there is absolutely no limitation. The air is free. However, the problem is that the air can be polluted. And yet, it is very difficult for an individual to try and limit that externality. So let's say you have some kind of factory that's polluting the air. It is very costly for me as an individual to do something about that. Yes, I could engage in litigation, but that is very costly. So instead, what happens is that government can intervene in such a situation where it is very costly for individuals to try and negate an externality, and instead can pass regulations that prevent or provide guidelines which reduce pollution. Also, the problem that arises is the so-called free rider problem. So in some instances, some will try to benefit from the actions of others. So the example that is provided is that you have a certain group of non-smokers that are compensating smokers for not smoking. So although I will benefit from the actions of others in dealing with that externality, what will happen is that I will not contribute any resources to addressing that externality. In other words, I will not contribute the smokers. I will not contribute to compensating the smokers. So essentially what we are seeing is we are seeing a free rider problem arising. I am free riding on the other efforts of others to address an externality. So again, this is why it makes sense for government to intervene. Another example is imperfect information. So how much is it that we need to compensate someone to not do something in order to reduce that externality? Well, the person that is responsible for externality has no incentive to give a true amount. Rather, what they would do is they would give a higher amount that they need to be compensated because that is to their benefit. So for example, smokers will try to persuade non-smokers that they require a lot of compensation to induce them not to smoke. In fact, a lot more than they really do require. So they will inflate the amount of compensation that they expect. Again, this is a reason for government intervention. So also at times what happens is that transactional costs are rather high. So for example, it might not be easy to get individuals, or it might be costly to get individuals to get them to get together to internalize an externality. But let's say forming a residence association that then can address externalities. Well, this can also be addressed by regulations. So in some countries, residents are mandated to form residential associations that then meet on a regular basis to discuss specific issues associated with the areas that they are living in. So this is where government can also step in order to get a group of people to internalize an externality voluntarily through legislation. Also, litigation is not without problems. Litigation is costly, and there is no guarantee that the litigation will be successful. So from a legal perspective, here what can happen is that government can take on the risks and the costs associated with litigation that would not otherwise be undertaken by other individuals or small associations or associations of individuals. So that is where government can also step in. So the public sector can try to solve or attempt to solve environmental externalities using two types of methods or two types of solutions. So these solutions can be, number one, market-based. So here the idea is to use incentives to ensure economically efficient outcomes. So for example, fines for polluting. These can be used to essentially increase the production costs that are faced by firms so that they feel it in their pocket, put it this way. So there is therefore an incentive that is placed upon a firm or upon an industry not to pollute. In other words, profits are reduced because of increased costs that arise as a result of excessive pollution. Okay, so that is the first potential solution. Then what we can have is we can also have direct regulation. In other words, there are certain laws that are passed. These laws aim to limit externalities, and hence what happens is that those that would potentially produce these externalities have to comply with these regulations. By complying with these regulations, they reduce externalities, or externalities are reduced. So an example that is cited here for direct regulation is that of automobiles, in other words, cars. So back in the day, there was leaded petrol, and many governments now require that cars run on unleaded petrol. So again, automobile manufacturers have to comply with that regulation in order to be able to operate in a specific market. So let's start with market-based solutions, and broadly there are three forms that market-based solutions to externalities, specifically environmental externalities, can take place. In other words, activities that impact the environment and the costs of which are borne by other parties aside from that is polluting. So first of all, we have fines and taxes, subsidies for pollution abatement, that's the second one, and also marketable permits. And we'll cover these in detail in the mechanics in the slides that follow. So the simplest solution is that of using fines and taxes. And the idea is that you levy or you place a cost as reflected by a tax or a fine onto the party that is producing pollution. So that is the idea of a tax or a fine. And this obviously has an impact on the amount of pollution that is produced, in other words, on the quantity. So we need to understand the basis of the problem. So what is it that happens when we have an externality, and why would a fine or a tax work in order to reduce a negative externality? So essentially there is a difference between the private cost and also the social cost. So there is a cost of producing something, and that cost is borne by either the individual or the firm that produces it. However, the social cost is higher when we take into consideration the pollution that is associated with it. So looking from a firm or individual perspective, the costs are only the direct costs of the inputs. So let's call it labor and materials into whatever is being produced. But when we take societal costs into consideration, well, what we need to do is we need to add pollution into the equation. So this is where a fine comes into play. What it essentially does is it makes the marginal private cost equal to the marginal social cost of pollution, and also the marginal private benefits equal to the marginal social benefits. So essentially what we do is we impose a fine, which is then a so-called corrective tax or a Pigouvian tax. Okay, so here is an example. So let's say we are dealing with steel producers, and what steel producers do is they pollute air. So an individual firm that is a steel producer is only concerned with the cost that it faces, and that is quantified by marginal private costs. However, once we impose a fine, what we do is we equate the marginal private costs with marginal social costs. And what this does is it reduces the amount of pollution produced by incentivizing the firm to cut back, while essentially incentivizing by imposing costs on the firm that is producing that per level of pollution. So hence, in the absence of a fine, what may be happening is that too much steel is being produced, and that is associated with an undesirable level of pollution. However, once we impose that fine, what happens is that production is cut back. And you will see how this works in the next slide. So how would a fine be reflected in this in the supply-demand framework? So let's assume that this is the marginal private cost, and this is a marginal private cost that is faced by a steel producer. And associated with that level of steel production is a certain level of pollution. So the more steel, the more units of steel produced, the greater the quantity of pollution that is produced. Note here what we have is we have steel output. But if we produce more steel, that means a higher level of pollution. So how is it that we can reduce the amount of pollution? Well, what we essentially do is we make steel production more costly. So what we do is we impose a pollution tax per unit. So the more pollution that is produced, the higher the production costs. What this does is it results in higher production costs, and therefore the marginal social cost now reflecting the marginal private cost plus the pollution tax per unit at each quantity of steel produced. So this is our marginal social benefit, and this is now our marginal social cost, and this represents our supply curve also. And this corresponds to a lower quantity of steel output. So in other words, distance between E and A is our pollution tax. And then the area between E, A, B, and C, so this area where I'm highlighting the corners of this rectangle, corresponds the total amount of pollution taxes paid. So what is the result of that? The result of that is that a lower output, a quantity of steel is produced in equilibrium, and because steel production is associated with pollution, this also results in a decrease in the amount of pollution that is produced. So essentially what the fine does is it imposes costs on steel producers, encouraging to either produce less steel in order to reduce their costs associated with the production of steel, which include both resources and also now pollution, or these fines and taxes encourage them to change production methods to methods that are cleaner. So the market quantity, or the equilibrium quantity in the market of steel, is higher in the absence of fines and taxes. However, fines and taxes result in a lower quantity being produced, and this is also associated with a lower level of pollution. So now the next question is, how much should we charge in order or what should the fine be to discourage a producer of pollution from producing pollution, or spending money on reducing pollution? Well, the idea is to think of in terms of the cost that is associated with dealing with pollution. And we can define this as the marginal cost of pollution abatement. And the more we want to deal with pollution, in other words, the more we want to reduce pollution, what essentially happens is that, and this is the way we go, what essentially happens is that we need to spend more money. Okay, so the price for pollution increases as we choose to deal with pollution, as we choose to spend money on and resources on abating pollution. So as you can see, what this line represents, the marginal cost of pollution abatement, is the relationship between the level of pollution abatement and also the price for producing pollution. So up to until which point does it make sense to spend money on dealing with pollution? Well, as long as the fine is higher than the cost of, or the marginal cost of pollution abatement, what will happen is that a producer of pollution will spend money on abating pollution. So right up until this point, what happens is that a company is willing to spend money on dealing with pollution. And the reason why is because the cost of a fine is higher than the cost of abating pollution. So therefore, what we are introducing here is an incentive that serves to encourage a producer of pollution to spend money and resources on reducing the levels of pollution. And this will happen right up until the point that a fine is higher than the marginal cost of pollution abatement. So the marginal cost of pollution abatement is rising, and efficiency requires that the marginal social benefits of pollution abatement equal the marginal social costs of pollution abatement. So if the firm is charged a fine of this, okay, F asterisk, and it is equal to the marginal social cost of pollution, the firm will undertake the level of expenditure on pollution abatement. So this is right up until this point that the firm will, or the producer of pollution will spend money in order to deal with this level of pollution. Otherwise, what they may just as well do is just to pay the fine. What we can also do is we can essentially not just fine and tax the producers of pollution in order to get them to cut back on pollution. What we can also do is we can use subsidies. And we can subsidize pollution abatement expenditures. In other words, we can encourage or give firms money to fund the purchase of pollution abatement equipment. So let's say that the marginal benefit of pollution abatement is represented by this curve from a firm's perspective. And let's say that initially we have absolutely no subsidy. There is a bit of an issue here that the marginal social benefit of pollution abatement differs from that. In other words, this differs from this. So the result in this instance is that the amount of pollution expenditure or pollution abatement expenditure that will be undertaken by a producer of steel will be lower than that. That is optimal from a societal perspective. So let's assume that we are initially on this curve. So what is it that will happen? Well, each additional unit or each additional dollar spent on pollution abatement equipment will be associated with less value, or will bring in less benefit. So what we want to do is, though, we want to ensure that the marginal social benefit of pollution abatement is equal to the marginal private benefit of pollution abatement from the perspective of the producer of pollution, which is our steel producing company. So what we do is we give that company a subsidy to purchase equipment. What is the result of that? The result of that is that the marginal private benefit of pollution abatement curve is then equated with the marginal social benefit of pollution abatement curve. And then the expenditure that occurs on pollution abatement equipment is equal to the efficient level. Okay, so an efficient quantity of pollution abatement equipment per unit output is purchased. Let's look at this in terms of a marginal social or marginal cost analysis and a marginal benefit analysis. And what I want to do is I want to remind you, hopefully you remember this from previous courses, that the marginal private cost curve is essentially the supply curve. So think about it this way. This is the marginal private cost before a pollution abatement subsidy is provided by government. And this is the marginal benefit curve. So up until which point does it make sense to produce steel? Remember, steel production is associated with pollution. So before the subsidy, the level of output is at this point here. Call it Q subscript M. Let's say that we are at these 2 points here, so that this is the marginal private cost of a supply and this is the marginal benefit. As long as the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal private cost, it makes sense from a supply perspective to produce more units of steel. And this happens right up until the point where the marginal private costs are equal to the marginal benefits of producing steel. But please note, this is also associated with pollution, right? So if we are producing at this point, we are producing more steel. Yes, we are looking at the market of steel, not the market of pollution. But the externality, the result is also a heightened level of pollution. So at this point, what we are essentially seeing is that the marginal social costs are still higher than those of marginal private costs. So what is it that we want to do? Well, by using a subsidy in order to get firms to invest in pollution abatement equipment, what we do is we lower the marginal social cost. So this is the cost now that is borne by society of the externality. By subsidizing pollution abatement equipment, what happens is the marginal social cost curve, so this curve, shifts downwards. So this is the marginal social cost curve after a subsidy has been provided. Note that the efficient level of output without a subsidy is at this point, but this is not what is happening, right? This is what should be happening, but this is not what is happening. Instead, this is what is happening before a subsidy. So now the new efficient level of output with a subsidy is more steel. So the result of lowering the marginal private cost with a subsidy is that the supply curve for the firms shifts downwards. So the level of output that is produced after subsidy corresponds to Q subscript S. So even then, we are still producing a quantity of output that is greater than the efficient level of output with no subsidy. So this is where we should be producing. That is the efficient level. However, okay, sorry, but before I say however, so essentially what we are experiencing is we are experiencing a distortion. The output level is higher than the efficient level of output. That should happen if there's no subsidy. This is what should essentially be produced. However, this is what we are producing. So hence we have a distortion that arises due to the provision of a subsidy. Too much steel is produced, but because a subsidy was provided for pollution abatement, we also assume that there is less pollution. Okay, and that is why the marginal social cost shifts downwards. But this is also associated with a downward shift of the marginal private cost curve for the individual firms. So yes, although the output level of steel is greater than would be under an optimal condition or that of efficiency, we do have less pollution. So hence the distortion is reduced to some extent by a lower level of pollution now being present. What we can also work with in order to reduce the negative externality, continue with our example of pollution, is we can use marketable permits. So this is a market-based solution, and what it involves is tradable permits which operate under a cap and trade system. So essentially what happens is that each participant in a market, let's say steel producer, is given or has a cap of pollutants that may be emitted over a period of time, let's say a year. So a limit is allocated. And what then happens is that these limits can be increased through trading for permits. So for example, you may have each firm being permitted to emit 90% of the amount it emitted in the previous year. So now what happens is that, let's say a firm wants to produce more output, but it is constrained by the amount of pollution it is able to emit because it has a cap. So what it needs to do is it needs to now buy a permit. So in order to buy that permit, it can go to other companies and buy permits from other companies. In other words, it pays money for these permits. In order for other companies who now become seller of these permits be able to sell these permits, they need to pollute less. So hence, what firms can do now is they can trade permits. So a company that cuts its emissions in half could sell some of its permits to another company that wants to expand production. So therefore, there is now a market-based incentive for companies to cut back on pollution, because what they can do then is they can use these permits for pollution, and they haven't used up the entire cap, and they can trade these. So firms for which the market price of a permit is greater than the marginal cost of reducing pollution will sell permits. In other words, they can get more from selling their permits than they need to invest in reducing pollution. Alternatively, firms will buy permits when the marginal cost of reducing pollution is greater than the market price of a permit. In other words, if it costs you more to reduce the pollution than to pollute more, but in order to pollute more, you need to buy an additional permit, then it makes sense to buy a permit. So firms in that situation, where the marginal cost of reducing pollution is greater than the market price of a permit, will buy these permits. So then the market for permits will be characterized by the following conditions in equilibrium. And this condition is or corresponds to the quantity of permits that is traded at a point where the marginal cost of reducing pollution is equal to the market price of a permit. So what marketable permits do is then they use the market mechanism to ensure economic efficiency in the reduction of pollution. Essentially, we are looking at a demand-supply relationship for permits that permit companies to pollute. So some companies will cut back on pollution, others will pollute more, but they will need to pay to pollute more. So they have an incentive to reduce their levels of pollution right up until a certain point. So one of the most effective tools or common tools that governments use to deal with environmental externalities are regulations. So what governments do is they set emission standards for automobiles, in other words cars. They state how much CO2 emissions can be produced per litre, let's say, of petrol by a car. In other words, they determine the amount of filtering that manufacturers must put in. They put forth regulations relating to the disposal of toxic chemicals. They outlaw smoking on airline flights and at airports and also in shopping centers. So it goes beyond just airline flights. And also smoking in hospital wards, that's obviously outlawed, something that used to be done back in the day. They impose laws requiring oil companies with wells in the same oil pool to unitize their production. They impose restrictions on fishing and hunting to reduce the inefficiencies associated with excessive utilization of these common resources. In other words, they limit the overconsumption of animals when it comes to a hunting context and a fishing context. And advocates propose that regulations provide a greater level of certainty. If firms are prohibited from emitting more than a given level of pollution into water, let's say, then one knows the maximum level of pollution that will be produced. So essentially you can plan ahead because you've quantified the amount of pollution. If we know that firms are only permitted to produce 500 units, let's say 100 units of pollution each, and there are 5 firms in the market, then we know that the maximum level of pollution will be 500 units. So that is a purported advantage of using regulation. There are 2 important classes of regulations. There are performance-based regulations. So these regulations, governments only care about the final outcome. So how much pollution is produced. So for example, going back to the example I provided on the previous slide, this would relate to the amount of CO2 emissions that can be produced per litre of petrol in a car. So for example, 10 units of CO2 can be produced per litre. If a car produces more than that, a car of a specific make produces more than that, let's say 15, then what has to happen is the manufacturers have to optimize the production process or the combustion process in order to reduce CO2 emissions. So this is the outcome. They regulate a specific outcome. So these are performance-based regulations. Then what we have is we have input regulations. So in this instance, much of pollution regulation focuses on practice and the use of inputs. So for example, government has banned the use of leaded fuels. So that is why everyone's now using unleaded fuels. Again, it makes sense to focus on performance. Why? Because the argument is that it's easy to monitor performance. A lot easier than to monitor the use of inputs. So what can be a positive externality associated with pollution-based taxes and performance-based regulations? Well, let's say that you have a producer that wants to produce more steel, but is limited by regulation as to the amount of pollution that can be produced. Well, one way to get around this is to innovate, in other words, to have a cleaner production process for steel. What this implies is that by polluting less, and sticking within the regulations, a producer can produce more steel that would otherwise be associated, in other words, an increased production of steel would be associated with greater levels of pollution. But because the process is more efficient and now cleaner, this is no longer the case. There are a lot of discussions as to what is the best way to force and stimulate innovation, or stimulate innovation specifically. So environmentalists argue, or they're less convinced than economists, that the power of normal economic forces will work. They believe that industries must be forced to innovate. In other words, they argue for the imposition of extremely stringent standards, which forces innovation in order to meet those standards, and evidence on the success of such a strategy is rather mixed. In certain instances, what has happened is that very stringent regulations have been challenged and have not promoted innovation, so that there is a drawback in using stringent regulations as a method to push innovations. In other words, innovation costs. So as long as the costs of litigation are lower than the costs of regulation or complying with regulations, which would entail innovation, then makes sense to litigate and challenge those regulations. So that is why stringent standards may not always work and may not always force innovation.